Right now, it's the death of Russia. Ukraine is gaining incredible strength. Tens of thousands of allied troops are already moving into battle. The Kremlin has erupted in shouting. Erdoğan has dealt a decisive blow to Putin. Russian planes will no longer fly over NATO. Turkey is preparing something incredible, and Ukraine is gaining an ally no one expected. These details will surprise you. Crimea is burning. Ukrainian armed forces drones are destroying the occupiers' equipment. The south of Russia is paralyzed. Europe is ready for retribution. Chaos is getting out of control. Trump shocked the world, and the US declared Ukraine's victory. Even Zelensky doesn't believe what's happening. This is the turning point of the war. A complete collapse of the Russian army. No tanks, equipment is breaking down, soldiers are being sent to die on foot. The world's second largest army is falling apart before our eyes. The Kremlin is hiding the scale of the disaster. The Ukrainian armed forces have launched a decisive battle on the front line. Enemy columns have been destroyed. Panic and Russian troops are fleeing. Ukraine is preparing a decisive strike. The end of the Russian army is near. An apocalypse for the Kremlin. This is what Putin feared most of all. All this and more in our program Hotspot. Breaking news. Erdoğan has openly struck at Putin. Turkey is entering the fight. Russian planes over NATO countries will be shot down without mercy. The Turkish leader remembers how back in 2015, 2 Russian fighter jets were instantly destroyed. And now, history is repeating itself. A secret plan. Turkey is building an alternative to NATO right under Putin's nose. Ukraine is gaining a powerful ally. How will this turn the war around? Watch for all the details.
Erdoğan has called on NATO to build relations with Russia following Turkey's model. Translating from diplomatic to plain language, Erdoğan is calling for Russian drones and aircraft to be shot down over NATO countries. Turkey itself did exactly that, back in distant 2015. After the annexation of Crimea, Russia entered Turkish airspace. President Erdoğan immediately gave the decisive order: shoot down the hostile enemy bomber without hesitation. By the way, after that, Putin never touched Turkey again and became almost panicked in his fear of Recep Tayyip.
He is a tough, strong leader who is guided first and foremost, and perhaps even exclusively, by the interests of Turkey and the Turkish people. We have a lot of overlapping vectors of mutual interest, and that's why, yes, and President Erdoğan never lets anyone walk all over him.
But then why? Already in 2025, when Russian drones are flying over NATO countries and fighter jets are violating Estonian airspace, is there no such reaction?
For Erdoğan, shooting down a Russian plane was a kind of show of strength and a demonstration of an authoritarian leader's willingness to defend not only the sovereignty of his own state, but also to extend his influence to neighboring countries. At the same time, Estonia primarily relies on other countries to take care of its security.
So it turns out that 10 years ago, the Kremlin decided to test NATO countries' patience, but received a tough response. And after that, Putin also pretended that he had nothing to do with it.
This was Putin flexing his muscles as part of his rivalry with Erdogan for influence in the Middle East, where Turkey had direct sway over the course of important geopolitical processes.
Turkey challenged the Kremlin. To protect Lithuania after Russia violated its airspace, the president of Turkey sent an airborne radar surveillance and control aircraft there.
This is more a demonstration of solidarity specifically with the North Atlantic alliances, and Erdogan himself and Turkey, which is a NATO member, are essentially showing their willingness in this regard as well to advance their own interests and boost their own status.
At the UN General Assembly, Erdogan promised to continue making efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine. Through direct negotiations, we are facilitating and have already facilitated the exchange of prisoners and bodies, and we are helping to determine the modalities for peace talks between the parties. And at the Crimea Platform Summit, Turkey declared its moral and historical duty, namely, to protect the rights of the Crimean Tatars.
Turkey has never recognized the illegal annexation of Crimea, and we have firmly maintained this position since 2014, supporting the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea.
Wait, but what will happen to Gazprom now? It seems that Erdogan is distancing himself from Putin and getting closer to Trump. It has become known that Turkey has signed a 20-year gas agreement with the United States.
Turkey's policy is based on multi-vector diplomacy, but first and foremost with an emphasis on its own interests. That's why we see very close cooperation between Ankara and, on certain issues, Moscow. At the same time, Turkey is a NATO member and has very close military cooperation with the United States, constantly trying to acquire various types of weaponry produced by the US.
Also, continuing its cooperation with the US, Turkey plans to purchase hundreds of American aircraft. This step may indicate that Ankara is working to restore strained relations with Washington, which arose due to the purchase of the Russian air defense system.
In the foreseeable future, we will also undoubtedly observe this comprehensive multi-vector approach from Ankara, specifically directed towards China, towards Moscow, and towards the broader regions of Europe and America. In other words, his main goal is to strengthen his own position.
And most importantly, Trump will receive Erdoğan at the White House. But the interesting question is, will they discuss global issues, or will they talk about how Erdoğan's route in New York was blocked on the eve of the UN General Assembly because of Trump's motorcade? Well, as you might have guessed, Macron wasn't the only one who got caught up in it that time.
Urgent reinforcements for the Ukrainian armed forces. Breaking news. Ukraine is receiving unprecedented support. Another country is ready to send tens of thousands of troops directly to us. Putin is furious. Countries are no longer afraid of the Kremlin. The ice has been broken. The coalition against Russia is growing every day. Who exactly is ready to risk everything and stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine? These details have blown up the internet. Watch this.
Even more help and support. The Ukrainian armed forces may receive reinforcements to fight against the Russian occupiers. The president of Indonesia stated that he is ready to send peacekeepers to Ukraine under the auspices of the United Nations once the appropriate decision is made by the UN.
We will continue to serve wherever the world needs defenders, not just with words, but with boots on the ground. If and when the UN Security Council and this General Assembly decide, Indonesia is ready to send 20,000 or even more of our sons and daughters to establish peace in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan, in Libya, anywhere peace needs to be ensured.
This is, accordingly, the 20,000-strong contingent that Indonesia is ready to send. It is not enough to monitor the situation along the entire length of the Russian-Ukrainian front. The length of the Russian-Ukrainian front currently exceeds 1,200 kilometers. Therefore, there is absolutely no compelling reason to speak of the overall effectiveness of a particular peacekeeping mission, specifically a substantial contingent of up to 20,000 well-trained personnel. In this specific context, this will be nothing more than a monitoring mission.
Earlier, the president of the UN General Assembly, Annalena Baerbock, stated that she does not rule out the possibility of deploying UN peacekeeping forces in Ukraine to maintain the ceasefire and support post-war recovery, if the majority of member states agree to it.
To organize a peacekeeping mission under the auspices of NATO, several stages must be completed. The first is the familiarization stage, when UN representatives travel to the country and acquaint themselves with the military, economic, political, and religious aspects of the territory where a peacekeeping mission might be deployed. But most importantly, to deploy a peacekeeping mission under the auspices of the UN, the consent of both sides of the conflict is required. That is not only Ukraine, but also the Russian Federation. And this is essentially a stumbling block, a dead end. For a UN peacekeeping mandate, budget approval is required. Again, the Russian Federation is one of the main sponsors of the United Nations. To say that they would be interested accordingly in financing a peacekeeping operation from the Russian Federation's budget is not true. That does not reflect reality.
Let us recall that on September 4th, a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing was held in Paris with the participation of President Zelensky, where possible future security guarantees for Ukraine were discussed, aimed at ensuring a just and lasting peace. 26 countries have officially agreed to form support forces which are to be deployed in Ukraine immediately after a ceasefire is established. As part of this plan, 2 separate ground groups will be created.
The presence of NATO military personnel on Ukrainian territory will be regarded by the Russian Federation as that country's participation in hostilities on the side of Ukraine. Accordingly, the Russian Federation will also declare the legitimacy of military targets at the moment of the physical elimination of these servicemen.
Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has already threatened that any European military contingents in Ukraine will become legitimate targets for Putin's army. He noted that their presence in Ukraine will be regarded by Russia as the occupation of the country by the West. He also added that the Russian Federation will not pay attention to the peacekeepers' flag.
The Russian Federation is categorically opposed to the deployment of any foreign military contingent on the territory of Ukraine. This is essentially a cornerstone, a Rubicon that they cannot cross. And accordingly, These discussions about the possibility of deploying a peacekeeping contingent are merely political posturing, a statement not backed by concrete actions. Everything depends on the position of the Russian Federation.
But for now, all of this is just a prospect. Whether Western partners will actually send peacekeeping forces remains an open question.
Urgent. Crimea has turned into another Chornobyivka for Russia. The Russians have simply been driven off the peninsula. It's hell there. And that's not all. The south of Russia is burning. Ukrainian armed forces drones have done the incredible. Russia is in a panic. Retribution from Europe is already near. Something incredible is happening. All about this right now.
It's very hot in Crimea again. 2 enemy Antonov 26 aircraft and coastal radar systems have been destroyed by Ukrainian GUR fighters on the temporarily occupied peninsula. The occupiers are uneasy in Tuapse as well. The local port is under fire and there has been a hit on the oil terminal. Local authorities also report that unmanned boats have been discovered in the waters of the Black Sea in the Tuapse district. Residents and visitors were asked to leave the shoreline, but these requests were unsuccessful and videos show people actively filming the explosions. And furthermore, the Russian Federation continues to cause trouble across the entire European continent. In the United Kingdom, a powerful explosion occurred at the construction site of the country's largest drone factory. Due to the incident in Swindon, hundreds of people were evacuated from the affected area.
The final answer must be given by the British law enforcement agencies, but it should be noted that the Russian connection will apparently be a priority in the course of the investigation. In recent months, there has been a sharp increase in the activity of Russian intelligence services in Europe, specifically in carrying out acts of sabotage and subversion at defense industry enterprises and within the logistics sector. In addition, in recent weeks, the Russian Federation has been demonstrating a so-called raising the stakes tactic, that is, an artificial escalation with NATO. This comprehensively includes both concerning incidents of airspace violations and, accordingly, the significant potential for devastating strikes on crucial, key NATO logistics hubs located within various European countries.
Meanwhile, US President Trump was informed about Ukraine's plans to launch an offensive for which American intelligence data would be required, according to sources cited by the Wall Street Journal. The publication writes that Trump was allegedly briefed on the current situation on the battlefield, emphasizing that Russia has achieved only minor successes in recent years.
In the Dobropilya and Pokrovsk directions, the situation has been stabilized, and there has been no further advance of Russian occupation forces deeper into Ukrainian territory. It was precisely this information that was conveyed to the President of the United States regarding the change in the nature of hostilities in Ukraine at one of the most problematic sections of the front.
In addition, Russian forces continue their exhausting attacks in the Pokrovsk direction and are preparing for an assault in the Kherson direction, according to the Institute for the Study of War.
At the moment, the most problematic sections of the front are the Zaporizhia and accordingly the Donetsk fronts. In the Donetsk region, this refers to the Konstantinivka direction, where the occupiers, unfortunately, have achieved a number of tactical successes, and the Lyman direction. It is precisely Russian troops who are attacking in the Lyman direction. The information from the so-called Institute for the Study of War about the successes of the Ukrainian defense forces in the Lyman direction does not correspond to reality. At the moment, the occupiers are trying to advance in the direction of Siversk and Yampol. The significant possibility of capturing the crucial settlement of Yampol would undoubtedly give the occupiers the strategic opportunity to simultaneously launch attacks both in the critical Lyman direction and, accordingly, in the important Siversk direction.
Russian authorities are planning to toughen the punishment for desertion for convicts who went to fight against Ukraine instead of serving their sentences. In this way, the authorities want to put pressure on prisoners who, under the pretext of fighting, were released and at the first opportunity flee from the battlefield.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Sensational news. Trump has seen the light. A complete 180-degree turn. Ukraine will get everything? Even Zelensky was shocked by these words. Russia is in trouble. This was the last straw. Now Trump is ready to take tough measures. This could bring Moscow to its knees. All the details in the report.
Has Donald Trump truly seen the light, or is he skillfully distancing himself from his promise to end the Russia-Ukraine war? What is behind the words of the 47th President of the United States? Not so long ago, the whole world was discussing the most scandalous meeting in the Oval Office with the infamous "Where's the suit?" And today, after another round of negotiations, the White House publishes this photo with the caption, "He is a brave man and he is fighting a hellish battle." And it goes even further. Donald Trump, who until recently insisted that Ukraine had absolutely no chance of defeating the great and powerful Russia, and that it was time to give up territory, posted this message on his social media. In it, Trump stated for the first time that Ukrainians can not only fight, but also win, while Russia is aimlessly treading water where it had planned to sort things out in a week.
In fact, this makes it look like a paper tiger, and when people living in Moscow and in all the big cities, villages and districts across Russia find out what is really happening with this war, the fact that they can't get gasoline because of long lines and all the other things happening in their war economy, where most of their money is being spent on fighting Ukraine, which has a strong spirit that only keeps growing, Ukraine may not only be able to restore its country to its original state, and who knows, maybe it will go even further.
This is the most pro-Ukrainian statement Donald Trump has made since his second coming to the Oval Office. This rhetoric was immediately praised by Emmanuel Macron and the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. But according to political analysts, Trump's position is dictated by a banal coincidence of factors. On the one hand, Europe has been increasingly asserting its independence lately. On the other hand, Ukraine's drone sanctions against Russian oil refineries are bringing Donald's dream closer to sever Europe from the Russian oil pipeline. And the cherry on top is the domestic political situation in the United States. It is precisely because of this that Trump has started calling Putin an aggressor and hinting at sanctions.
He needs to respond to the situation. He is, after all, a political animal in the classic political sense. A politician who senses the mood, who always acts based on the context, on what is advantageous at the moment and what is not, on what is the right or wrong move for him, rather than from any deep ideological, value-based or other convictions. That's not about him. That's why now we see what seems to be a reversal of position, although in reality it's an evolution. I'll even say, albeit generally and with some reservation, giving a certain benefit of the doubt, but based on the events of recent weeks, I can assume that the darkest night with Trump is already behind us. This 8-month period when Trump could still flirt with Putin is coming to an end. And now we're entering a phase where Trump will no longer be a lever in Putin's hands to put pressure on Ukraine and Europe. And it's not a given that he will become a lever in the hands of Ukraine and Europe to put pressure on Putin. And it's not a given that Trump himself will want to put pressure on Putin. We shouldn't be under any illusions here, but I think the moment when Trump was part of the problem has already passed. But for now, Trump is not part of the solution either.
Donald hasn't charmed the Western press either. Journalists recalled that, in fact, all the initiatives that were loudly discussed across the ocean have remained unfulfilled. The introduction of sanctions, as well as 500% customs duties and designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, have all remained just empty talk.
Trump made it clear that he is ready to take radical steps only after America's allies make their contributions first. In fact, that's exactly what he said. There were no hints of additional aid or that the US plans to punish Moscow more seriously. Because those legislative initiatives we keep recalling remain just that, initiatives. They are not being voted on. Trump is categorically opposed to having his Congress vote for the imposition of sanctions. He says, I will make the decision against Putin myself, and he will spend another month thinking about whether he trusts Putin or not. He literally said this just yesterday.
Some analysts believe that Donald's statement is not an epiphany, but an attempt to wash his hands of such an important issue as stopping the war. The 47th President of the United States has actually managed to profit from the war. Irrevocable aid has been halted, and weapons are being supplied to Ukraine with European money. Whether this is an awakening or a skillful attempt to distance himself will be determined by the next steps taken by the White House administration. So far, the US has not even joined the statement by 36 countries at the UN General Assembly, which calls on Russia to stop the killing and begin substantive negotiations.
Shock, a catastrophe in the Russian army. Russian soldiers are being sent to their deaths literally on foot. There are no more tanks left. Even cannibalizing equipment, ripping spare parts from old vehicles no longer helps. Tank crews have only one option left: to abandon their weapons and run for their lives. The Ukrainian armed forces are destroying the remaining armored vehicles, and the Kremlin is in a panic, hiding the scale of the disaster. Russia has run out of tanks. What does this mean for the war, and why is this the end of the world's second army? Watch this.
Russian tanks are on the verge of extinction. It seems the Russian military-industrial complex can't keep up, and soon there will be nothing left to fight with at all. And apparently sanctions are to blame for this.
The role of sanctions here is more about the fact that these are supply chains, these are integrations, worsened logistics, and also due to the shutdowns that Russia is carrying out, which further significantly weakens the advancement of technologies like artificial intelligence, which Russia could have developed.
It seems that Putin's so-called resilient Russian economy is finally showing a noticeable crack.
Sooner or later, the inevitable overheating of the military economy may not necessarily lead to its complete collapse, but rather to a very sharp and significant downturn. The general economic trends in the Russian Federation will also affect the military sectors of the economy.
It would seem that, for the first time since 2022, salaries have started to fall at Russia's most important enterprises. And yes, we're talking about companies in the military-industrial complex.
Undoubtedly, lending to enterprises in the military-industrial complex has an impact. And the form and volume of this lending differ from those in the non-military sector. This used to be an advantage, but now it's become a disadvantage. In fact, having reached its peak, it's now either plateauing or declining.
But how do staffing shortages and economic problems affect the increase in Russia's military-industrial output?
With the Russian economy's ability to supply the army, to provide the war with equipment and ammunition, these resources are not limitless either. Moreover, even with rapid expansion, the modern Russian economy may not be able to reach Soviet-era levels.
Of course, sanctions are no joke, especially when they worsen the condition and quality of your military equipment, or may even halt its new production altogether. But that's when Soviet-era tanks come to the rescue.
The focus shifted to restoring Soviet equipment. Old Soviet equipment taken out of storage, restoring ammunition, as well as overhauling and preparing it for combat. But these resources are not limitless either.
But now the time has come when old equipment doesn't make the job easier, but rather complicates it.
There are fewer and fewer units that can actually be repaired. They have to repair things that aren't even meant to be fixed, to overhaul the unrepairable. They piece together working units from several different ones. This requires significantly more effort, work, and so on.
So, instead of producing new and modern equipment, Russia is increasingly using old and worn-out machinery.
The production of new and essential equipment is significantly hindered both by international sanctions and by the fundamental unpreparedness of the existing manufacturing base. That's precisely why the ramp-up in the production of modern types of weaponry is nowhere near the necessary pace Russia truly needs to adequately make up for its substantial losses on the battlefield. So, consequently, they much prefer to fund things that will deliver tangible results here and now, rather than waiting until tomorrow or even the day after.
And let's not forget Putin's loyal friends, China and Iran, who are actually helping them a great deal.
We have always been together, and so we remain together now.
But any delivery is more a way for Beijing to keep Moscow on a short leash.
It's precisely the technological base that China is helping the Russians to pull up. At the same time, the Chinese are helping Moscow strictly from the position of a suzerain. That's why they keep their hand on the tap. If Moscow acts properly, they might open the tap.
But in the end, what do we have as of today? It is known that in 2024, Russia's military industry reached the limits of its capabilities. But what are Russia's prospects now?
The question is
whether the Kremlin will be able to maintain this level for long, and whether it might turn out that an unexpected blow will come not from the front, but from within. Here,
the pervasive corruption within Russia is, in a rather ironic and unexpected way, our most significant ally. The more extensively and brazenly the high-ranking generals and the powerful, influential icebreakers of the vast Russian military-industrial complex continue their systematic and egregious stealing of resources and funds, the considerably less chance they will ultimately have of effectively maintaining their strategic position and staying firmly on this elevated and critical plateau of power and influence. But of course, that goes without saying. Indeed, that is true.
Sanctions are only a small part of what can help Ukraine defend itself against the Russian Federation. Nevertheless, an important factor is also the increase in Ukrainian military weapons production.
One can believe that everything will be decided by sanctions, but it is also necessary to develop our own power, which is what we are doing, and to respond to strikes with strikes. This is one way, and sanctions are just an alternative to weapons, but not a replacement for weapons. And that's why we have to work on both fronts.
Right now, our forces have thoroughly crushed the occupiers to dust, leaving behind strikes and mountains of eliminated enemies. The Kremlin is in a panic on the Kupiansk front. Everything is falling into the abyss for them. Experts are sounding the alarm, but Ukraine has a chance for a major breakthrough. So what is the General Staff preparing? Why has the enemy found itself cornered right now? All the latest events from the front line. Watch now.
2 fighters from the Skala regiment caught 8 occupiers by surprise as they entered the village of Novotroitske in the Pokrovsk district of Donetsk region. The first 3 were eliminated by the Ukrainian fighters immediately as the Russian soldiers approached the ambush, and the rest were destroyed using a grenade launcher and drones. The Pokrovsk direction remains the hottest spot on the front line. A third of all clashes and assaults on the front line occur precisely in the Pokrovsk direction. Despite such intensity, all attacks have been unsuccessful. To achieve their objectives, the occupiers are willing to do anything. In the Pokrovsk direction, a drone recorded Russian soldiers shooting a family of civilians and taking a young girl hostage. The child was used as a human shield to cover assault groups. Russian sources acknowledged that the Ukrainian armed forces are repelling all attacks by the Russian army and are successfully conducting counter-offensive actions to push the occupiers away from Pokrovsk.
In the Pokrovsk direction, the enemy has focused its efforts on breaking through toward Novotoretsk. Footage has surfaced of a firefight between the enemy and our forces in the village. The enemy is trying to cut off our salient. The situation is being characterized by impressive reports from the field. This has been going on for more than a week, including in terms of control over the villages that have been taken.
To advance, the Kremlin is transferring reserves to the Pokrovsk direction from the northern Kharkiv region, as well as units that participated in the Zapad 2025 exercises in Belarus.
The enemy is trying to use its numerical, material, and technical superiority to achieve a number of its ambitions. These ambitions are quite serious. The enemy is literally dreaming of taking full control of both Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, and advancing through parts of the Dnipropetrovsk region, and also parts of the Zaporizhzhia region, moving toward Hulyai-Pol. In
the Zaporizhzhia region, near the village of Stepnohirsk, Russian soldiers tried to find a weak spot in the defense held by Ukrainian fighters. The units of the Ukrainian armed forces stopped this attempt at its root, and the enemy fighters were eliminated. Thanks to their numerical advantage in infantry, the Russians are constantly looking for ways to break through in the Zaporizhzhia region.
The greatest number of attempted advances remain in the area of Plavny through Primorsk, where enemy groups are constantly being detected and targeted. From there, they either try to push deeper into Primorsk or attempt to infiltrate Stepnohirsk. In particular, yesterday a small group somehow managed to get into the western outskirts of the settlement, but they were eliminated by the defense forces. At the very same time, there are periodic and persistent incursions occurring east of Stepnohirsk, where the enemy consistently seems to be probing the entire area for potential weak spots in the defensive lines and actively looking for a significant gap that could potentially be used to penetrate much deeper into the territory, but so far without any notable success, thanks to the highly effective and commendable work of the Ukrainian pilots.
Unfortunately, these attempts are sometimes successful. In the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions, the Russian army has occupied Nova Mykolaiivka and Nova Ivanivka, and has also advanced near Kalinivske, Ternove, and Nova Ivanivka. Such active assault operations are accompanied by enormous losses in personnel. This 21-year-old liberator who lost an arm and a leg is actually considered lucky. He waited only a week and a half to be evacuated from the battlefield.
They didn't take you out right away, did they?
Almost alone with her.
In how much time?
11.
11 days without food, without water. No.
Well, why was there water?
This is a visual aid for techies who are planning to go to Ukraine for the so-called SVO. This is exactly how the Kremlin takes care of its soldiers, using them as cannon fodder and then simply forgetting about them.
That's all for now. For more hot news from the front, tune in to the next episode.